Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Dragon's Breath Bow Wow. Coming back at you with another Archon's Armory. Today we'll be talking about Titan armories as the first in the beginning of the cycle. I know we had a tight race there for a bit, but don't worry if you voted for minor Xenos weapons or for anything else. The cycle will come around, and in another 4 videos, you'll get another shot at it. Everything that loses a vote will be on the next vote. However, if it loses 2 or 3 votes, I may drop the loser from the last one. So, get what you want, get your votes in, and let's get right to it. So, a general overview and chassis types. I know we just did a video on Titans, so let's do a quick recap, and if you want more detail, you can go into those videos that I have just released. So, weapons of Titans are heavily based on class, so there are a lot of weapons that Warhounds and Reavers can use, but there are ones that only Warlords or only Imperators can use, etc. There's some back and forth compatibility, but an important thing is that the size of the weapon will change based upon the platform that it's on, generally, or it won't be a primary weapon. So, non-removable versus semi-removable. I hold to it, even though the lore seems kind of confused on this, that most Titan weapons are not removed in between combats unless they are damaged or need severe retooling. Now, with Reavers and with Warhounds, I think it would be reasonable to keep 1 or 2 either reloads for an existing weapon, such as a rocket pack, or optional removable things that can be stuck on or off like carapace weapons, depending upon the situation. But for things like Warlord weapons and Imperator weapons, even if it says that they might be removable, in theory, I think that we need to leave that in theory. I do not believe that these weapons are easily capable of being removed from the Titan, even if there are backups available, which is not always the case. Matter of fact, I think it is a very likely chance that backups for especially Imperator weapons will simply not exist. They will not be available a vast majority of the time. So, weapons. So, important thing, I'm kind of cutting this down just a bit because I'm trying to get slightly more listenable videos, which means that they're going to try and be less than an hour, but I'm not going to cut things out for the sake of time. But for things that will be not so highlighted in this video, might be in a lore video, might be in another video on Titans, weapons will not be mentioned twice, unless there's a significant size difference. So, if I mention a certain weapon during the Warhound video, or during the Warhound portion of this video, I might include that it's used on other Titans at a bigger scale, but unless there's an actual difference in the designation of the weapon, aka it has a different name and different function, I won't mention it twice. Then back or arm weapons will not be specified, so you're going to have to look that up on your own. I might have some details about things that could fit on the back, could fit on the arm. Obviously, some things will be carapace weapons inherently, but if I roll over something and you wonder whether it's back or arm, just type in the name into Lexicanum, you'll be able to find it. And then unique patterns or unique weapons, 2 specific patterns, will be in another Armory video. So we're going with common use weapons only. For example, Psi Titans will not be getting a lot of play in this video. I will be able to do them in a different video. A lot of the very specific, hyper-specific relic weapons that belong to Titans might not be in this video. And while I will be going over a lot of general melee weapons that exist or have existed, and also filling in the gaps where they aren't necessarily so prominently shown, I will also not be going into any of the unique Chaos weapons that we see on certain Titans. I might be talking about Chaos in this video. I'll be talking about some of the weapons that Chaos might favor, or some of the ones that we've seen, or might be more available to them, but I won't be going into, like, Atrocitus's weapons, or into the sound weapons of the Emperor's Children that they put on Titans. Those will be in a separate video, specifically about Chaos Corruption of Titans, or something of that nature. So, moving on. Most weapons for Titans are multi-purpose by default due to their size. So when I talk about armor protection and vehicle protection in 40k, there are generally 4 levels. There is light armor, which is kind of things that have between, 10 or 20 millimeters of steel armor, up to around 80 to 100 on at least one surface. And then they can be open-topped or have a lot of weak spots. That's light armor. Generally, it's in the middle. They'll have like 40mm plates to 20mm steel plates. Medium armor is anything that has at least one surface that's 100mm of rolled homogeneous armor, or plasteel equivalent. It could be entirely 100mm, or it could be anywhere between 100 to 150, or have one surface that's up to 150mm of rolled homogeneous armor. Heavy armor is anything that has 150 plus at least one other face, basically, that has more than 150mm of plasteel. Now, these are general categories, and you can see they're kind of wide, medium's kind of thin, but it applies to specific vehicles as a standard. For example, an armored car is light, a Chimera is medium, a Leman Russ is heavy, and then super heavy, or the level above that, is where you put Knights, Titans, Baneblades, all of those heavy support units, and those are in their own category. And even though it is a huge category with a lot of variety, basically every single weapon in the arsenal for Titans, except maybe one, is able to penetrate heavy armor without a lot of difficulty. In some cases, it can do it with no difficulty whatsoever. In other cases, we will talk about that it might struggle against those kind of heavy tank designs. So, Warhounds, like I said, I've done a whole video on all of these, so go back and watch that. But Warhounds, they're the scouts and guards. They're running around relatively quickly. They've got a pretty good mile time. They're using a lot of super heavy weapons that aren't quite up to the level of true Titan weapons just yet. So they're used to guard other Titans and not necessarily fight other Titans. They can especially outnumber and outmaneuver Reaver Titans, but Warlords are a little bit more than they can chew, and generally even Reavers will be able to outgun them if they have some good anti-Titan weapons. Reavers, those are battle line brawlers. These are the most multi-purpose, general use, both far away and close up and dirty Titans available. They are a very medium class. Medium armor protection, medium size, medium weaponry, so they have a lot of good Titan weapons. They're the first true Titanic class, but they are not big enough to use some of the much larger, more cataclysmic weapons available to the Warlord or the Imperator Titan. The Warlords, they're kind of the sniper support for the Titan Legions. There are some that say they are relatively close range. I'll go into why I don't believe that that's actually true, or at least the definition of medium or short range for a Titan is very different than what we might think of for like a tank. But they are the sniper support units. They're very tall, they have very long range anti-Titan and anti-super heavy weapons, and a lot of them are built for siege, for support, to be walking artillery in many cases. Imperators are very rare, but they are one of the only generalists of the Titan types. All of their weapons are anti-Titan, again, by default, due to its size. All of them are big enough to pretty much KO anything short of a Warlord Titan without much difficulty. Again, you could argue that certain weapons are better at it or worse at it, but the Imperator is so big that quite often it doesn't matter. And as I say, they are generalists. They have lots of support weapons, they have many different good weapon options, and most of their weapon options are effective against almost every single thing in the Imperium, or in Chaos, or anywhere else, especially against other Titans. They are deadly, and that's why I mark them as walking fortresses and the only generalists amongst the entire legions. So, moving on to Warhound weapons in specific. I did a little bit of liberty with the subclasses in these. I did specific things. I would collate stuff that doesn't really make too much of a difference. A lot of Titans have specific designations based on what weapons they're using, but more frustratingly, they would have designations that said that they were different, but showed and explained no functional difference. So, for example, it would have a name. It would say that the Titan was particularly aggressive or used for scouting, but it was otherwise completely unchanged from the regular Titan. I would ignore those subclasses, and I would focus upon the subclasses that actually had a functional difference. So, when I go through subclasses, it will be things that differ from the regular significantly enough that I felt like I needed to note them. So the first one is Wolves, and Wolf Packs are paired Warhound Titans. Why does this matter? One, it's because Wolves are always paired in twos. Now, I am a big supporter of Warhounds deploying as pairs to guard Warlord and other types of Titans, and provide them with a little bit of fire support. The other interesting thing about wolves and wolf packs in general is that they always have the same exact weapons, so they're not complementing each other, they're effectively making sure that if one of them goes down, the other one will be able to achieve the mission. So, in this picture, you can see that they have a Vulcan Megabolter, which is anti-infantry, anti-light, and medium armor, and a Turbo Laser Destructor, which is anti-Titan and anti-heavy armor. So you can see that they both have a multi-purpose kit, but there's also two of them, which means that not only can they double up on firepower, but if for whatever reason they are knocked out, they're not leaving the Warlord Titan behind them, or possibly Imperator Titan behind them, without significant defenses to keep it protected. So they're kind of a double layer or a fail-safe measure when they're deployed as wolves, and they also have the ability to double up on support weapons. The Mastiff. These are hit-and-run solo boys. Now, the Mastiff and the Jackal, I think, are more based upon the weapons that they have here. So, the Mastiff would probably be equipped the same way that these wolves are. One long-range anti-Titan weapon and a kind of generalist weapon like the Vulcan Megabolter. But the hit-and-run aspect really kind of seems to me like they would be equipped with weapons that can harass enemy Titans and reave through or do a lot of damage to vulnerable enemy medium vehicles, light vehicles, or infantry. So I think that a build like a plasma blast gun or a turbo laser destructor would be a pretty solid build for them. While the Jackal says that it is equipped with a extra void, which I think is reasonable. You can definitely modify Titans to have at least one extra void shield generator. It is a big draw on the power systems, and we'll talk about that at some length during this video. Titans do have a limitation in how much their plasma drives can actually power, which means that certain weapons will be limited for them, and they will have, literal physical power limitations, like if you were plugging a bunch of things into a power strip. At some point, the Titan's engine can give out if you're trying to pull too much energy from it in too short of a time. Now, what I think is also pretty interesting with the Jackal class, and I've added a nice picture here. This dude is on Instagram. Please go find him. I love his art. Where he's made a double close combat weapon Warhound Titan, but that Warhound also has a melt-a-gun on one hand and a flamer on the other, or possibly two flamers. It says the Jackal has an Inferno gun and a Vulcan Megabolter. Now, I think it could swap that out for double Inferno guns, double Megabolters, or even double, other weapons that are closer range. But I think that this would also be a pretty solid Titan to equip with a melee weapon in place of the Vulcan Megabolter. Now, why is that? It is quick, and it is designed to go up close with things that are of its own weight class and slightly below. Now, why do I say that it isn't designed to take down larger Titans? Mainly because the feat weapons of something like a Reaver could still threaten a Warhound with death. It's not like a very small threat. Getting kicked by a Reaver would probably put down most Warhounds, or at least cripple them. So I think that punching other Warhounds in the face, using something like Lightning Claws and then fire, would be a really solid plan for the Jackal, because it can crack open the armor of its opponent and then spray in a bunch of fire. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the Inferno gun in general. And then finally, one of the most unique Warhounds, and one of the ones that I'm not such a big fan of, is the Dire Wolf. The Dire Wolf, down here, is a extra heavy back weapon anti-Titan Warhound. Essentially, it has been cut down, its physical size has been increased, its arm weapons have been divorced from essentially a theoretical extra joint. They have been changed to only be a flat joint, instead of one that can move both up and down and sideways. Or at least it seems that way, so it's lost a little bit of its flexibility. But in exchange, it carries a genuine Titan weapon on its back. Generally, this is something like an extra turbo laser destructor, a volcano cannon, some large plasma weapon, or missile. This is really a tank destroyer Warhound. I dislike it because even though it says that it's extra armored, it is also noted as, well, naturally, as it carries an extra weapon, it is going to be slower. So the Warhound's main advantage, with all of its weaknesses, with all of its ability to be kind of kicked around by bigger Titans, with the fact that its void shields are not as powerful as other Titans, with the fact that it fights far away from Titan support quite often, I find the Direwolf to be very much a liability to its own crew at times, and it should absolutely operate more as a sniper or a ranged support weapon than trying to go out and hit targets that could theoretically outrange or hit it back. That's just theoretically. I'm sure that there would be a reasonable use case for the Direwolf. For example, if you had no Warlord Titans around, having a couple of Direwolves supporting a Reaver that was more made for mid-range combat, I think would be reasonable. But I think that's a very specific use case, and making a Direwolf or equipping a Warhound as a Direwolf takes not only a ton of extra resources, but a great deal of modification to the chassis. You can see here that the entire back carapace of the Warhound is split open. It is literally separated and shoved maybe 5, 6, 10 feet apart in order to make space for this weapon. And I just feel personally like that is a significant amount of allocation of resources just to make a Titan that is theoretically going to be in danger due to the way that it is designed and how it is supposed to engage. Using it as a tank destroyer, kind of a shoot and scoot thing, solid. Using it as a support weapon, solid. But sending it into battle and telling it to go shoot down other Warhounds that might be able to dance around it, I think that's a real problem. So, moving on. Kinetic weapons. The Vulcan Mega Bolter. Now, this is one of the classic ones of, this is a super heavy weapon, but it's not super heavy to the point where other Imperial forces couldn't get their hands on it. For example, the Guard have the Vulcan Mega Bolter on one of their Bane Blades. And what the Vulcan Mega Bolter is, it is a 5-barrel, double-barreled, so it is a doubled-up Gatling bolt weapon. So similar to the heavy bolter, it's probably a 35, or in this case, probably a 40 millimeter rocket-propelled, fully automatic, rotary cannon that, provides a significant amount of punch in that it is basically a 40 millimeter rocket, but it is also shooting at absolutely blistering speed. Now, this is one of the least, I would probably say the second least useful weapon in the Warhound's arsenal. It's really generic, it's pretty basic, it's very effective against medium vehicles and below, but against heavy vehicles, I think that the Vulcan Mega Bolter has to sustain a very significant amount of fire. I'm talking about several hundred rounds in order to ensure that something like a Leman Russ is going to be knocked out completely. To disable a Leman Russ, all you would really have to do is spray it down the front. But that does risk you leaving a tank behind that could theoretically get right back up and be used against you again, fire at you from behind, for example. So I think that its anti-armor capability, as we've talked about in the bolt weapon video, is limited. And even with its high rate of fire, it could punch through enemy armor eventually, but given its lack of accuracy, given the 2 barrels are spaced, in considering they're firing even at their apex or at the lowest part of the kind of housing, as you see here, the barrels are going to be roughly 3 feet apart, which means that the impacts are not going to be simultaneous. They're probably not going to be in the same exact location every time because it's a mobile platform. So I think that these would have a hard time penetrating heavy armor, but anything else they could pretty easily batter through it, especially light armor they would just perforate and destroy. So very useful, super brutal at anti-infantry. I'm not discounting this weapon's usefulness at all. I just say that, as a weapon that is expected to be used against all targets, it will suffer against heavier armor. Like the Leman Russ or up-armored versions of the Leman Russ could probably survive a couple of sprays with this, but concentrated fire will blast through the armor and destroy it eventually. So, moving on. Missile pods. There's not a lot of art of these, but they are a canon thing that they're equipped with. It says that they are mounted on the shoulder, which I find very cool, but I would consider these similar to a fire and forget weapon that could be attached to an aircraft. Kind of a dumb rocket. And these are going to be on the same side as the Apocalypse missile launcher, again, in my opinion, in my estimation, they would be 3 per shoulder or 2 per shoulder, depending upon the size and how big these are. And these are 300mm unguided rockets. Being fire and forget rockets is actually a pretty solid thing because many Warhounds lack that anti-infantry or that, vehicle or fortification destroying weapons. All of their armor-piercing weapons are very specific and focused, like the plasma blast gun and the turbo laser destructor. And then all of their anti-infantry weapons can struggle with armor, can struggle sometimes with lots of heavy weapons. Slapping on a couple of missiles doesn't seem like an unreasonable thing to me. And a 300mm rocket, that's a really devastating punch. Even if they're unguided, the Warhound is technological enough so that you'd be able to essentially aim it by eye at a target, kind of shrug your shoulder towards it, hold for a second, get a targeting solution, so to speak, and then spray essentially 300mm rockets at something like a couple of Lehman Russes that have been bunkered down in an area, a bunker line that has a bunch of anti-armor weapons, and just blast that out of your way, and boom, problem solved. Warhound keeps going. Obviously, with any missile weapons, we have to be concerned with them getting hit by enemy fire and exploding, but considering that these are likely to be high explosive weapons instead of armor piercing, which I think is consistent with all of the Apocalypse missiles, they are more high explosive than they are armor piercing. While they can flip over lighter vehicles or completely disable even heavy vehicles by shattering their vision blocks, breaking weapons, destroying armor seals, and destroying their tracks, obviously, I think that they would not do too much damage if they detonated on the carapace, because that is one of the most heavily armored portions of the Warhound, on the upper back and shoulder. It is one of the better places for anything to impact like artillery. Moving on to the more odd energy weapons. The first one is one of my favorites, and it's right up here, the Turbo Laser Destructor. The 2-barreled version is the one available to the Warhound, and it has a pretty limited traverse up and down, but it has a pretty solid traverse right and left, and of course the Warhound, being a mech, can tilt itself forward and backward to get more angles of fire. What I love about the Turbo Laser Destructor is it is a literal giant las cannon. That is all that it is. It is an absolutely enormous las cannon. It will burn a hole basically the size of a soccer ball right through anything you want to point it at. It is pretty close to a true Titan weapon. It's just a little bit too small to be considered one. Now, it has some disadvantages, obviously. It has a lot of energy draw. It is a laser weapon, which means that it will lose damage over range. Significant range. We're talking kilometers here, not like 500, 1,000 meters. We're talking kilometers and miles here. Maybe, I don't want to say something off the top of my head, but let's say 5 miles. It'll probably start losing a bit of impact damage. But even at medium range, you could absolutely decimate a tank with the Turbo Laser Destructor. Lehman Russ, you'll turn it to ash, or, well, you'll melt a giant hole through it, basically. Or 2 holes in the case of the Turbo Laser. The other interesting thing about the Turbo Laser Destructor is the Warhound can modulate the strength and power in order to lower the wear on the weapon, and also to fire individual barrels at once. And this is one of the things I like about the Turbo Laser Destructor, is 2 targets at equal ranges or at different ranges, fire 1 barrel first, re-aim, fire the 2nd barrel. And I love that for anti-tank duties. If you have the Turbo Laser Destructor, you can sight a large number of enemy tanks in the distance, let's say 10 tanks, and then all you have to do is sit exactly where you are, because if you can see them, you can kill them with the Turbo Laser Destructor. You pop one with 1 barrel, another one with the other barrel. Wait a second or so, pop 1, pop 2. Pop 1, pop 2, and you can just be very consistently pinpoint targeting enemy armored threats and killing them with the Turbo Laser Destructor. A very efficient weapon, and actually one that I like a whole lot. And I think it becomes even better with the Reaver, because what the Turbo Laser Destructor has at this level, with that either full power blast of 2 beams against things like other Titans or against super heavy vehicles, while it cannot overcome the Baneblade's armor very easily, it can slag areas of it, it can heavily damage the armor, and it can also destroy things like weapon mounts. So, not useless, but definitely you want to use it on full power, both blasts at the same exact target, instead of that kind of pinpoint one at a time thing. You can also extend the length of the laser like you can with the las cannon. We talked about that in, I believe it was the heavy weapons video. Yeah, no, we did an actual las cannon video, an individual one with energy weapons, yeah. So, the next one, the Inferno Gun. I count this as the weakest Titan weapon, which is hilarious because it is a triple-barreled, super heavy flamer. Now again, like I talked about with the Knight version of this, the Knight version of this being like the Conflagration Cannon and the Inferno Cannon, this is essentially a mix between a gas flame weapon, which uses a flammable gas like propane or like gasoline fumes to propel itself out and create something similar to an acetylene torch, but on a much larger and more uncontrolled basis. And on the other hand, it has a liquid fuel that it sends out with it. So not only does it give it the projection power of a gas flamer, it gives it the weight, the arc, and the continued burn of a liquid flamer, of a Physaline, Promethium, etc. flamer. Now, I call this the weakest Titan weapon because it is one of the only Titan weapons that will do absolutely nothing against other Titans. The Vulcan Megabolter does not a ton against other Titans. It would only really be able to disable a Warhound if you did very long bursts of focus fire at weak points on the Warhound in order to really disable it. The Inferno Gun would need to have significant amount of time to do damage to a Warhound, and even against things like heavy armor, and especially against super heavy armor, it will struggle or it will be ineffective because it is fire. Fire has its limitations. Fire can only burn at so high of a temperature, and plasteel, rolled homogeneous armor is very resistant to fire. That doesn't mean that the people inside of it are resistant. You know, smoke, heat damage, cooking off of ammunition, definitely possible, but in order to do any of that, you need to significantly heat up the area, which means that you need to focus the Inferno Gun on a single target, which basically defeats the point of having a flame weapon that big, because you want to twist it and do big swaths of the enemy infantry or of enemy squishy targets in order to clear them out with the Inferno Gun. That being said, that downside being acknowledged, it has some very good uses in anti-infantry conflicts, because obviously Giant Flamer is giant. But also the really interesting thing, and this is what I think sets apart the Warhound weapons from the Knight version of this, the Warhound can carry an absolute boatload of fuel. An insane amount of ammunition for the Inferno Gun. Enough that it could basically afford to fill something like a bunker complex with the Inferno Gun and basically burn out an entire section of the enemy defense by itself. Now, why do I say that a Knight couldn't do this? Essentially, it's because the amount of weight that a Knight can tote, even a Dominus class Knight, is going to be vastly inferior, or at least half as much, as a Warhound will. Warhounds are huge, they have huge storages that are armored inside of their bodies instead of being on the external like they are often with Knight weapons, and the Inferno Gun is able to tote around lots more fuel in comparison to its Knight counterpart. So, I think that is one of the main advantages, is that the Warhound can afford to literally just spray this thing like it's a super soaker covered in fire. Like, it is very, very capable of hitting more targets than the Knight version, and I think for that reason, it is still very efficient against infantry, because, like the Vulcan Megabolter, hits a lot of targets, makes a lot of area dangerous, makes lots of shrapnel and noise, and is scary. Great reasons to use the Inferno Gun. The Natrix Melta Lance. So, this one's a little specific, and I think it's more related to the Direwolf than anything, or to other specific modifications of the Warhound Titan. But I think it's a pretty solid idea, and that's why I included it. The Natrix Melta Lance is a back-mounted, single-barreled Melta weapon. Now you might say, why use a single barrel for the Melta? Multi-Meltas exist, right? Because they're used on heavier vehicles, and they make a larger hole. The Melta Lance seems to exchange that wider hole, that wider damage, for a much more focused stream of plasma and metal. Almost like using a plasma cutter or a plasma torch to melt metal. You want something that is highly focused and puts all of its energy into the smallest possible area, so it will get more penetration. And in the case of the Natrix, the Melta Lance, I think that this is actually tuned for range. So, given that the Warhound is going to be in and out of combat a lot, given the fact that it's going to be very mobile, having a weapon that is relatively short range, for a Melta, it's probably one of the longest range Melta weapons available that isn't the Reaver Titan's Melta weapons. It is pretty preferable, and especially if it is relatively easy to put on the back of the Titan and it isn't taking up an arm slot. So, not a terrible idea. I saw it. I thought it was really interesting to have kind of a longer range Melta weapon. And I think considering that a lot of the weapons on the Warhound have issues with armor, like the Vulcan Mega Bolter or the Inferno Gun, having a back-mounted anti-tank weapon, whether it's related to the Direwolf's, anti-tank job, or it's just a normal thing that you could put on a Warhound, is a cool idea. Plasma Blast Gun. There are larger ones available on larger chassis, but let's just talk about the Plasma Blast Gun as a base, because it is quite possibly my favorite weapon to exist on tabletop, and it is definitely one of my favorite weapons that the Warhound can be equipped with. It is capable of basically shooting a double barrel burst equivalent to a large plasma cannon. So this doesn't do a ton of splash damage, but it is like taking a pair of somewhere between like trash can and extra large milk jug sprays of plasma in their, magnetic force cage and shooting them at a target at a significant distance. These things are relatively solid in terms of anti-armor. They can fire more quickly than something like a plasma cannon, but not by a ton. These are not the same exact design as the later ones that we'll talk about with the Warlord and especially with the Imperator. So they are more limited in rate of fire, but they have very good range, they have pretty decent accuracy, and they are really good at anti-armor because, of course, plasma melts, eats through armor very easily, and the added impact of this is that unlike the Turbo Laser Destructor, the Plasma Blast Gun has a small area of effect. So it can hit more targets with one blast than the Turbo Laser Destructor can. So it can kind of be one of the few generalist weapons where it can work against infantry a little bit better than the Turbo Laser Destructor can, but it can also work against tanks very well, just like the Turbo Laser Destructor can. So it makes up for one of the main downsides of the less armor-piercing weapons it can penetrate armor, and it makes up for the heavy armor-piercing weapons in that it can hit more than one target at a time, and it's able to do some pretty solid spraying of plasma. The AoE damage from this double splurt of plasma isn't huge, but when we're talking Titan-sized weaponry, isn't huge. It includes like a 10-meter area. So, if we're talking about squads of any enemy infantry, Plasma Blast Gun can absolutely deal with them. Theoretically, I think you can fire it staggered like the Turbo Laser Destructor, but I'm not sure. I can't really count upon that. You can make up your own mind. I think if it was able to do that, it would be even better. Melee. So, I'm going to be talking about the feet of each Titan, because that is an important part for their melee combat. The Warhound's feet are basically useful for crushing vehicles that it can't kill on its own, or for kicking around knights, but it is basically useless even against other Warhound Titans. The Warhound's feet cannot rise all that far, just because of the balance of the vehicle. It's so low to the ground that if it rose up its foot too far, it would fall over sideways. It can jump a short distance, but I don't think this could be used as an offensive weapon, especially because the Warhound doesn't seem to be able to easily raise itself if it falls over on its side. It might be possible to twist around and kind of force itself back up, but this is a time-consuming and dangerous method, which the Warhound wants to avoid doing. So the Warhound's feet are best used against creatures much smaller than it, and even against knights, it might be a better idea to use your weaponry than try and rely on kicking them to death. The Natrix Shock Lance. This is a Warhound Taser Lance. It is kind of like those ones that I recommended be created for the knights, kind of this more basic, simplistic, long spike of metal that comes out of the shoulder, and is laced with something electrical. It is essentially a taser that the Warhound will jam into a target, electrocute them, destroy systems, turn them off, ruin their, electrical surfaces, etc. And then the Ursa's Claw, which is a shock harpoon grabber. Similar to this, the Ursa's Claw just shoots out of the Titan, grabs onto an opponent, electrocutes them, and then tries to pull them back in, or tries to rip off sections of them. You'll notice that this is a common theme with Titan weapons. They have either projectors that shoot electricity, or like a projected weapon that shoots electricity like the Ursa's Claw, or they will have a taser weapon like the Natrix Shock Lance. The Ursa's Claw, interestingly enough, was also given to the Conqueror, which was Angron's flagship during the Heresy. Just an interesting little factoid there. Archaeotech weapons. Conversion Beam Desolator, the Graviton Destructor, and the Volkite Eradicator. Well, I have already talked about all three of these different types of weapons. Again, Conversion Beam weapons, these are going to come up in other Titans, so we're just going to go over them really quickly now. Conversion Beam weapons, you have to stay absolutely still while you fire them. This is definitely one of the things that you would have on the Direwolf's back, so it could be stabilized. You need to stay dead still while you fire them. You need to remain at a certain distance from the target, and it literally turns matter into energy. So it will explode things based on their density, detonate them, and this continuous beam gets stronger and stronger and stronger until it starts losing energy. So there's kind of this bell curve of energy where if it hits something at dead close range, it's not all that powerful. If it hits something at mid-range, it's at maximum power, but if it goes out to far range, it loses its energy again. Not to mention that waiting for the beam to go that far takes a significant amount of time. The Graviton Destructor, again, similar to the Titan ones, this is just a gravity weapon. It takes a large object. At this point, considering that this is Titan size, gravity weapons are going to be grabbing things like entire tanks and just kind of squishing them. And the Volkite Eradicator. Volkite weapons at this size lose most of their disadvantages. The big disadvantage of the Volkite Eradicator was you had to focus on a target for a while to heat up the water within it to microwave or cook the target, but it would also get mitigated by lots of thick armor and protection. Not so much Titan weapons. The amount of radiation coming out of them, the beam width and length, essentially means that anything on the target that had water is going to eradicate into steam, explode, expand, cook, and then if it is able to focus for any amount of time, it is essentially just going to melt the crew inside of the vehicle. Again, Volkite weapons are horrible. You will light on fire. It's a very nasty way to die, but these are relatively rare. They're definitely Archaeotech weapons, and if you run into them, just be wary. Chaos. What does Chaos use? And also, I'm going to add into this what is my favorite layout for these, because I've talked about Titans a lot now, and I like them a whole bunch. Now, I think Chaos would definitely prefer to use weapons like the Turbo Laser Destructor and the Ursa's Claw, or any other type of melee weapon that they can attach to it. Now, the best option, in my opinion, for Chaos would be the Turbo Laser Destructor, and then the Plasma Blast Gun. Now, the reason for this is the Plasma Blast Gun is going to deal with infantry, and the Turbo Laser is going to deal with other Titans. And while the Plasma Blast Gun can deal with Titans, it would be a pretty solid plan to burst down their shields with the Plasma Blast Gun, and then hit them with the Turbo Laser Destructor, max power. Why is that? Why do the Chaos folks want to do that? I would think not only is it the fact that neither of these require any ammunition other than ionized hydrogen, which is relatively easy to get. See the Chaos Forces still having plasma weapons after all these years. But in addition to that not requiring kind of irreplaceable ammunition, it also has a lot of utility. The Turbo Laser has a ton of range, which not a lot of Titan weapons have. Which means that the force, if a Titan goes to Chaos, it is immediately going to be very risk-averse. It may be aggressive, but the force deploying it is going to be like, we only have one Titan, and we're not getting another. So, keep your pants on. We are not going to put you in super harm's way right now. So, Turbo Laser Destructor is good for sniping out enemies. It's good for destroying even heavy enemy threats from a good distance away. And the Plasma Blast Gun essentially helps out when there are little squishies around that you need to deal with, or it can make the anti-armor potential of the Titan even that much more dangerous. Hitting something with a Plasma Blast Gun hit, like a super heavy vehicle, and then shooting it with the Turbo Laser Destructor in the same exact spot, pretty solid chance that you're going to penetrate. And it is very deadly even against other Warhound Titans that might be more equipped with a generalist layout, like a Vulcan Mega Bolter and an Inferno Cannon or something like that. Or like these guys where they have a Vulcan Mega Bolter and a Turbo Laser Destructor. A Chaos Titan would want to overcome them more easily, and thus it would pick two anti-Titan weapons that have a little bit more generalization. Whew, that's long. This is going to be long. Sorry about that. But Reaver Titan, moving on. The subtypes for these ones. They were a little bit harder to do, and I'm still kind of confused on one of them, but the Vandal is pretty much the most easy one to do. The Vandal is up here. Carapace weapons don't seem to matter all that much outside of the Goth, so they can kind of just be equipped with whatever they want based on the whatever subtype they want. So, the Vandal is the shortest range Reaver. Reavers are those brutal bruiser midline units. They're kind of the medium Titans. These are relatively fast, so they're a little bit quicker. They don't sacrifice much armor, but they aren't as heavily armored as a Warlord because they are more spread out. Essentially, they have more joint range to do here, but they are also better shielded, and the armor they do have is thicker than the Warhound. But its weapons are usually its Melta-Cannon, which is a very heavy anti-tank weapon, and also a pretty solid anti-Titan weapon, and usually a melee weapon in addition. So, this is a really bruisy unit, and a really brawly unit at that. It is a get-up-in-your-face, stay out of the way of my support weapons, I'm going to kill you personally type of layout is the Vandal. And I could also see it being very, very dangerous if you were in a siege situation. Now, why is that? One, it has the advantage of being short range, and you have the disadvantage of being in one place. So if a gate had to be broken down, if an enemy force had to be rooted out, bringing in a Vandal and having it splatter your defenses or destroy the center point of your defenses, whether it's a Titan or a super heavy redoubt or something like that, it will do the job. Huns. I have this one as a Hun, but I'm not sure if it would qualify necessarily, but we'll go into that later. The Hun is a ranged fire support unit. So it will usually have a Turbo Laser Destructor and a Volcano Cannon. These are the opposite of the Vandal, which wants to be fast, hitting individual targets and then getting out of the way, or grinding it out in close with its Melta weapon and melee weapons. This one is the opposite. It essentially will stand back with the Warlord Titans, and it will do support things. It will destroy hard points in enemy defenses. It will shoot down other Titans. This is one of the big ones where I think a Hun Reaver would deploy with a couple of Warhounds. So the Warhounds can protect it, they can distract enemy Titans that are coming to fight it up close, and the Reaver will support them by killing any Titan-grade threats that may be harassing them. And then the Goth. The Goth is a siege super heavy, and it seems to be a unique design, or at least a design that is set up in such a way that it is only going to be equipped with some of the heaviest weapons available to the Reaver. I have this one here because it's got a double Turbo Laser Destruction on the Carapace, and I think the biggest thing with the Goth is that it has a Carapace modified for super heavy weaponry. Now again, that's my theory. You could have different ones, but for the moment, I'm going to go with that. So, energy weapons of the Reaver. We have the Turbo Laser Destructor, triple-barreled version this time. Now, the biggest advantage of this is not only the fact that you now have 3 barrels that you can 1, 2, 3 with the Turbo Laser Destructor, but due to them all being combined and the Reaver having a larger power plant than the Warhound, the energy coming through all 3 barrels is heightened and you have an extra barrel to play with. That means that not only is it more powerful pound for pound than the Warhound version, it is also damaging a wider area. It is an energy weapon, so that isn't necessarily a great thing, but the wider area is, 3 times as powerful. It has a lot more penetrating power, not to mention that whole staggering of shots thing. It's a very deadly weapon. Again, I'm a big fan of the Turbo Laser Destructor, and I think especially with the Reaver, which is designed to deal with a lot of different targets, it is the bruiser, it is the battle line, it is supposed to deal with Warlords, Reavers, Warhounds, and anything below that level. The Reaver is supposed to be able to deal with. And I think the triple-barreled Turbo Laser Destructor helps it deal with a majority of those threats without sacrificing anything in the bargain. So, does it need anti-infantry? Not necessarily. It will usually have support for it 90% of the time, and if that isn't Titan support, it will be at least infantry support. Anything that the infantry can't deal with, Turbo Laser Destructor will be able to take out a majority of the time. When it can't, you have the Volcano Cannon. So, the Volcano Cannon is essentially the Volcano Lance that the Imperial Knights have, but you've tripled the power output. So again, when I say that the Hun is probably equipped with a turbo laser destructor triple barrel and a volcano cannon, you have one heavy anti-armor weapon on one hand that can do staggered shots, and you have another huge anti-armor weapon on the other hand with extreme range and pretty acceptable accuracy. The volcano cannon will essentially take all of the power and energy powering the turbo laser destructor and focus it into a single beam. So you don't have that issue with staggering, you don't have that issue with overheating or reloading. It's just one highly concentrated anti-armor shot. Volcano Cannon is very deadly, very dangerous. It can be used against those super heavy vehicles, those enemy titans. So a pretty solid plan would be Turbo Laser Destructor, 1, 2, 3 shoots down a Warhound Titan's shields, for example, and then you hit it with a solid shot with the Volcano Cannon. Shields are gone, Warhound Titan's dead. Pretty solid chance. Melta-Cannon. Now, the Melta-Cannon is one that I referred to with the Vandal. It is a giant, double-barreled Melta, equivalent in size to something like the Vulcan Megabolter. You can see it here on this kind of stand-in for the Golf class, and also here with the Vandal. Now, it does kind of look like a giant air radiator, but that's really just to contain the sheer amount of heat in this weapon. Now, when I say that this can penetrate stuff that even the energy weapons might struggle with, for example, super heavy armor, the Melta-Cannon can probably slag a Baneblade with not much difficulty. It could definitely destroy a Reaver Titan or a smaller class Titan if the enemy Titan's shields were down. So this offers you absolute maximum available penetration to the Reaver in exchange for being short range. It really is a shorter range weapon. It definitely isn't as close as something like a melee weapon, but it is not going to be something that you use at range. It's going to be something that more a Vandal would use to get in, get an instant kill or like a cheap shot kill on something like a Baneblade, and then back out. Also very likely that the Melta-Cannon has a bit of a lead-up time, a little bit of a warm-up time, and probably a regeneration period, because it is firing so much plasma and so much metal like a Melta-Cannon does. You know, this massive spew, almost like a double-paired exhaust. Like, if you could imagine what the exhaust of a rocket going into space looks like, that would be what's coming out of the front of the Melta-Cannon. Plasma and hot metal. So, kinetic weapons. The Gatling Blaster. This is one of the coolest weapons in 40k. I don't have it pictured here, but you can find it pretty easily. The Gatling Blaster is a 150mm assault cannon. It is a fully automatic Gatling weapon chambered for 150mm shells. There are larger versions available on larger Titans, but the larger versions don't get bigger shells necessarily. They get armor-piercing rounds, which I find horrifying, but even with high explosive, this is a fully automatic, rotating barrel artillery gun. It is a shell lobber. It is heavy artillery in our modern day, but it's fully automatic and coming out of a barrel that is full artillery length. So the scary thing about the Gatling Blaster is while it has insane firepower in its high explosive and also its armor-piercing high explosive capacity, you know, being capable of penetrating medium armor very easily, it's also fully freaking automatic, which means that if you fired it at something even for a short burst, you're gonna blow a tank to shreds with high explosive. This isn't like the Vulcan Megabolter where it's a bunch of little impacts and detonations. No, these are each individual, bigger than Lehman Russ tank-sized shells impacting a Lehman Russ. So, heavy artillery in the Imperium is usually 132mm. These shells are bigger than that, coming out of the same size barrel, meaning going the same speed or similar speeds, and they are impacting at a Gatling speed. You're getting the picture here. This absolutely destroys basically everything. Anything short of a Warlord Titan is going to be fearing the Gatling Blaster. On the downside, it has ammunition, it is very consumptive of ammunition, and also it's going to have limited ammunition reserves because 150mm shells are very, very large. I'm not sure if you've ever seen that type of ammunition, but it's pretty big. Also, in addition to this, it doesn't have terrible ranged accuracy. Again, because it is long-barreled, because it is using an actual artillery shell instead of a bolt shell. That means that it actually can have some decent accuracy at range. So this could be used almost like a mobile spray and pray artillery barrage. Horrifying, I know, but the idea of a Reaver Titan essentially toting around a regiment's worth of artillery in one hand is terrifying, and I love it. I love the Gatling Blaster a lot, but I wouldn't recommend Chaos. So, the Apocalypse Missile Launcher. So you see this up here, missile launcher here, missile launcher here. These are those 300mm unguided rockets. And now in the regular one, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, looks like 20 rockets. So, 20 300mm unguided rockets. That's a lot of firepower. Now you might say, what if you hit them and they explode? They have armored housings and armored protection, not to mention that they fire from a concealed position, essentially. So, unlike the Warhound, which they might explode on contact, the Reaver seems to be pretty well protected from any ammo racking occurring with the Apocalypse Missile Launcher. And the really cool thing about these ones is they're not designed to be fired like in ones and twos. No, these are ripple-fired, which means an entire bank of 3 or 4, or even 5, or even the whole set of 20 might go at the same time. 300mm rockets, that's a ton of high explosive mass. If you have a line of heavy vehicles, like you have 30, 40 Lehman Russ tanks, and you get sprayed with a long burst of 300mm unguided rockets. Again, you can make firing solutions from these. The Reaver is capable of doing that, but they're not guided, they're not wire guided or electronically guided at all. They're just kind of figured out where the rockets are going to go, and then they spray them in an unguided spew. If you shot that at a defensive structure like I was describing, a bunch of armored vehicles, it's going to flip them over, it's going to spray up huge gouts of dust, it's going to make craters. It is essentially going to act again like a unguided artillery barrage on that area. These do have limited ammunition, but still, an on-call artillery barrage, not to mention if you go against enemy Titans, who dog can that be very nice for taking down enemy void shields? But even then, the Reaver already, as you can see, has a ton of essentially pocket ammunition, or pocket artillery ready to go. Melee weapons, Reaver feet. So, the Reavers have much larger feet. They have the ability to kick a lot better than the Warhound does because their joints are at their hips, and they have a lot more mobility with them. They can kind of reach back and reach forward. They are much more centered, and their body is conical, so their weight is not so far towards the ground. They have a more humanoid shape, which means that they can kick, they can stomp, they can crush things, and they can step on much larger vehicles, like the Baneblade, where the Warhound wouldn't be able to. So, a little bit more utility with the feet, but the Reaver has our first really scary melee weapons. The first one, and kind of the more important one, there's a chain fist as well, which is useful, but I think that it's only useful against Titan weapons. I think the most useful one is the power fist. The chain fist is cool, it is, believe me, and it has plenty of uses, but I think the power fist is the best all-rounder. Essentially, this is pretty similar to a normal power fist. It has a static field instead of a disruption field, but it can punch, it can swing, it can crack at things, and more importantly, it can grab, and it can also throw. So, picking up a Lehman Russ tank with the Reaver Titan and whipping its sidearm like a baseball is not an impossible feat. And I think the more scary thing is that you can build up some serious momentum with the power fist, and you can punch. Because the Reaver is able to run, able to move at a speed that the Warlord is not capable of because of its much heavier carapace and the Imperator couldn't dream of because it is even heavier, the Reaver can build up a lot more momentum with its weapons. Which means that against enemy Titans, it can get some serious punches off, or even some nasty kicks off, in comparison to its contemporaries, and especially the Warhound. I feel like being in a Warhound and getting hit by a Reaver Power Fist, I think that might be the end of you. You might survive. I'm gonna be honest though, if he gets a straight up like clean hit on the side of a Warhound, I think that might permanently cripple it. I think that might rip a leg off. But yeah, that's just a theoretical thing. So, Archaeotech weapons. We got two. Very important, very interesting, and I think they're both related to the Goth. The first one is the Vortex Missile. The second one is the Warp Missile. How are they related? I'll tell you in a sec. So, again, like I said, I think these are related to those Siege super heavy Goths. But the Vortex Missile is a warp capable, or a warp ICBM. If you don't know, I'm going to be using the word ICBM quite a bit. It means international or intercontinental ballistic missile. So, usually, intercontinental ballistic missiles are nuclear. In Titans, they generally aren't. The Vortex missile is something even worse. The Vortex missile acts like a D weapon for the Eldar. It fires out, and the psychic resonance within the warhead of the weapon when it detonates rips a hole in the warp, essentially creating a portal at its point of detonation, sucking everything in and turning everything into unreality for a second before assumedly collapsing or growing, depending upon the chaos affectations in the area and what comes through the warp hole. Let's hope it doesn't expand, but I think there's a pretty solid chance that it will, and even if it doesn't, you're still creating a hole into hell on a designated target. This is useful against everything. There's not a single thing that this isn't useful against. Maybe demons, but even then, it's still an explosion. So, it creates this kind of localized black hole into the warp, which can, suck in the materium around it. It's very dangerous, it's very deadly. The other thing is, insane amount of range. Again, ICBM, intercontinental, that's hundreds of kilometers. That is a huge distance. And it can do this as a support option. There's usually only one of them on the Titan. It's essentially a super extra long-range support weapon. And you would use it when you see confirm enemy Titan, see the Titan, or identify it via other forces, type in a firing solution for the Vortex missile, fire the Vortex missile, enemy Titan no longer there. Problem solved. Warp missile. This one's a little confusing. You would think the Vortex was the warp and the warp was the Vortex, but the warp missile's a little different. It is essentially a really big, high-explosive rocket, similar in size to one of the Apocalypse missiles, one of those 300mm unguided rockets, roughly. But what it does is, once it is fired, it uses an onboard warp engine to rip open a hole in reality and essentially disappear from our plane of existence, and then reappear somewhere. Why would it be useful if it's somewhere? Sometimes it's inside of the enemy. Sometimes it goes through their void shields. Sometimes it teleports into their armor before detonating. Essentially, it is a teleporting rocket. You fire it with a solution that you hope it will follow, whether it is to disappear instantaneously and reappear a long distance away, or disappear once it senses enemy void shields and then reappear inside of them, essentially bypassing the void shields. Either way, it's a weapon that basically uses teleportation through the warp in order to manifest in a place where it normally wouldn't hit. Very dangerous, very deadly, quite unreliable. I'm going to be honest with you, this one seems to me to be a bit of a liability and a bit more random than I like for a Titan weapon. Chaos. And speaking about favorite things that I like, I think the Chaos Reaver Titans are even neck and neck with some of my favorite Chaos Titans. I like Warhound Chaos Titans as well, but I think that Reavers are much more useful. They become the true capital weapons for the Chaos Forces. I think that the best possible option for Chaos Titans would be to copy the Hun architecture. A turbo laser destructor and a volcano cannon, both of them have such good affectations on target, and if you were to sub one of them out, I would say go full bore and sub a melta-cannon and a melee weapon in. Why is that? Again, lack of ammunition need, lack of capacity, ability to affect different targets, and if you could get an Apocalypse missile launcher, all good for you, but I think that it's actually unreasonable to expect Chaos Forces to have the Apocalypse missile launcher, because holy hell is that a logistical nightmare to obtain. 20 rounds, that's all you get, and then you have to make all of these 300mm unguided rockets. Now that's better than having a complicated missile system, but still, that requires actual industrial capacity that you're not going to be able to do on top of your random void ship. So, keep them if you got them, smoke them if you got them, but don't expect to be getting constant logistical support if your Chaos Forces firing off your Apocalypse missiles at nothing. Warlord Titans, moving on to the good part, or what people prefer is the good part. This one was really complicated, and I took a bit of time researching it. I'm sorry this is coming out so late, and it's going to be so long, but, bear with me, folks. The subtypes for the Warlord Titan are the Eclipse and Night Gaunt. These are lighter armored and more mobile, possibly short-ranged. The only example I could find that said that they were short-range said that they used shorter-range weaponry, or at least they engaged at shorter range. The only visual reference I could even find for that was this Chaos Titan with the sound blasters, as those are sound weapons, they are shorter range, but a vast majority tend to be of the normal variant, like these two, or of the Nemesis or the weapon head variant. So, weapon heads basically stick in a weapon where the head should be, but the Nemesis are a little bit more reasonable. Unlike the Eclipse and the Night Gaunt, which have lighter armor, they're a little bit more mobile, and they might use shorter range weapons. Again, based on the lore, I think that's a little bit unreasonable, given what the Warlord Titan is designed for, but there might be specific reasons. For example, if you had 4 Melta cannons or 4 sound cannons or something like that, you would be forced to go to short range, but you're still unbelievably overwhelming firepower based. The Nemesis is a siege artillery and a special weapon mount. So it shoots things, it has things like the Quake Cannon, it'll have something like a super heavy cannon like this Nemesis weapon, and it will act as siege artillery, or it will service a very specific weapon system. Energy weapons, there's really only one big one, and that is the Plasma Destructor. And you'll note that a lot of the weapons in this are kind of back and forth based on whether it is a Warlord or not. So, the Plasma Destructor is the biggest one. It is a big blast gun with burst fire. Essentially, the blast gun had those 2 or a single large explosion of plasma energy. The Plasma Destructor has that, but it will shoot 3 or 4 shots of them. It will essentially be a burst or a spew of these weapons. So, very, very powerful. Very big blast. There doesn't seem to be any kinetic weapons available to the Warlord Titan. The only ones that I saw were these upgraded volcano cannons, which you will also see on the Imperator Titan, the Vengeance Cannon. Or sorry, not the Vengeance Cannon. Oh goodness, I'm missing it. Oh no, it's missing in my line. Oh no, it's missing in my line. I will look it up 1 second. Whoops, I always get these. Warlord Titan weapons. Sorry, I should not be looking up things in the middle of thing. I'm sorry. Sorry. Let me just double check. Yeah. So, the bigger version of the Volcano Cannon, the, much larger one, the much larger version of the Volcano Cannon is the one that you will often see here. So, while they do carry these carapace laser destructors, the more common one and kind of the universal one that I see are these much larger volcano cannons. Again, for that whole thing of the Warlord being a super heavy support weapon. So, its big energy weapons are the Plasma Destructor, the Volcano Cannon, which we already talked about with the Reaver Titan, and they will also carry turbo laser destructors. So, melee weapons. There are a couple that were interesting to me. The Warlord Titan, it is very heavy, and due to its carapace weapons, it kind of doesn't tend to engage in melee combat all that often. But the Warlord feat, still perfectly capable of crushing things. Unlike the Reaver, it can do a lot more damage to things like structures, and it can step around obstacles in its path. Again, I'm sorry for that little pause in the video. Really sorry. I'm sorry. I spent a lot of time making this, but I missed some things, and I kind of double speak sometimes, especially with the Volcano Cannon, because it's kind of complicated. It's just another really super heavy laser weapon. But even with this, it's even bigger, and it's got even faster reload. I'm rambling. Sorry. Continuing on. The Saturine, or the Saturnine, or whatever, Las Cutter. So we talked about Las Cutters before. It's kind of a projected disruption field with the addition of being a laser and a melee weapon. So for the Warlord, this seems to me like a very specific thing, where if you're in a siege situation or a period where you're going to have to blow down a door or cut down a door, and it's like super heavily void shielded, so the Warlord can't necessarily destroy it with that, bring up the big old Las Cutter weapon, essentially just cut a line straight through something like a hive wall, and the disruption field will just destroy it, and then you can kind of push through it with your sheer mass. The harpoon missile or harpoon weapons. These are essentially stab, shove, and shock weapons. Usually they're mounted on the arms of the Titan, and they will essentially shoot out or spray out or grab, and they will yank back while electrocuting the target. Because of the weight of the Warlord, it can do things like rip Reaver Titans off their feet. It can absolutely crush Warhound Titans, and anything smaller than that is essentially just going to be smashed with an insane amount of weight, and then gripped and yanked off of wherever it is and towards the Warlord. These are going to be very short range. And they're probably going to have some serious downsides. But, bare minimum effectiveness is going to shock the absolute heck out of the target. Finally, push swing melee weapons. These are way more basic, and they belong both to the Reaver class, Warlord class, together. These include things like maces, mauls, spikes, blades, swords. All of these can be hooked onto an arm or essentially placed in a way where the warlord can kind of swing its stubby shoulders and punch other warlords or like punch reavers in the face. Occasionally they're given a big old power fist or power claw or just a claw in general. But even those, it's not very flexible. Its size and the weight of its armament will generally wear it down, and it will keep it from fighting with any amount of elegance, but having that melee weapon around, having essentially the call an ambulance but not from me last option backup weapon, will keep people from trying to rush you in the Warlord because you have a weapon that can, with one swipe, slaughter a Reaver Titan, where even the most deadly, well-armed melee Reaver is going to take a couple of swipes and hits to kill a Warlord. You know, it might damage it or cripple it, but in the 1 or 2 hits that the Reaver has to take to damage you, you only need 1 to kill the Reaver. So, definitely like a cost-benefit analysis there. And then Archaeotech weapons. There are 2/4 big ones for this. So we already talked about Volkite, gravity, and conversion weapons. It's essentially the same exact deal, we just scaled it up by 2 classes. Conversion beams are super deadly. At this size, you're not talking about aiming at individual targets anymore unless they're enemy titans. You're talking about aiming at entire hive structures like spires, like spaceports, and just aiming, focusing the beam, and deleting them from existence. You just leave a massive crater where this thing fires. Gravity weapons, you're picking up something the size of a large building, crushing it into one tiny piece, and then dropping it on the ground. Even more disturbingly, there are some gravity weapons that can move the debris before dropping it, or even whipping it at someone. But even then, aiming at something like a Titan that has its shields down and just kind of crushing it, that's almost an instantaneous kill against a Reaver and below Titan. Volkite, same thing. You've increased the range, you've increased the lethality, decreased the amount of places you can hide, which I think is even scarier. Because the bigger the Volkite weapon gets, the wider the aperture of the weapon gets. That essentially means that you can, like, delete entire swathes of infantry, like you have a magnifying glass and you're burning ants on the sidewalk. That's what Volkite is at this size to a human. It's a giant death laser beam that can just turn you into microwaved meat. Gross. Again, I love Volkite, but gross. Quake Cannon. Quake Cannon is the big one, and the most confusing one. It is a dead planet gun. This, you can see it here, Quake Cannon. It is a super heavy artillery piece on a large, heavy Titan support platform, and its ammunition is dead planets. The souls of planets that have been struck with Exterminatus or otherwise destroyed. A section of them is collected, and it is fired at something up to 24 kilometers away, and it is just decimation. It's almost like a nuclear explosion. It is a huge outgassing of detonative force that literally makes the ground shake. It causes, like, earth to liquefy. It causes huge sections of the ground to fall in on itself. It can make sinkholes and artificial damage to the ground. It can cause earthquakes in certain areas. And the interesting thing is that I'm not exactly sure how it does it. It seems to imply that the death of the planet is what is providing the destructive power of the Quake Cannon, because it has to have its ammunition from one of those dead worlds. Now, what I think is that there are 2 theoretical options for this. One, a large amount of death on one of those planets causes a huge psychic backlash when it happens, both in the warp and in real space, and what the Quake Cannon's ammunition is essentially a concentration of all that death, all that suffering, all that warp energy, for lack of a better term, all that human suffering, and concentrating it into a weapon that essentially unleashes it as a massive psychic scream to the point where it affects reality like a warp weapon would, or like a psyker would. So, that's my first theory. Second theory is that it has some sort of stasis where it collects kinetic energy. Yeah, literally collects energy where you would have a station or a position from which this energy is collected on a planet actively undergoing exterminatus. Again, don't know how you do this, don't know how it would work out, but it might work out better than the psychic thing, because, more dangerous. And then, as that stasis field breaks, it essentially re-exits all of that energy. So all that kinetic energy, all that sound, all of the impact that sensor was feeling is essentially stuck into a stasis field and then fired at the enemy. It hits the ground. It unleashes this insane kinetic impact onto the Earth, which literally makes the ground shake like a big crump that just destroys everything in a distance because you have liquefied the ground with kinetic energy. That's my best theory, guys. Sorry if it's not up to your snuff. So, Chaos. Whatever they can get. I mean, seriously. At this level, Warlords are a luxury for Chaos. It is rare that they have more than one, and even when they have one, that's considered a full-on Chaos Titan Legio. A Chaos Titan deployment may only include a single Warhound, just to get a reference for you. And the idea of multiple Warlord Titans being deployed at once that are serving Chaos Legions is a thing reserved for the nightmares of Imperials. Commanders and civilians alike. So, biggest thing is just whatever you can get. I think that they would definitely specialize in the more ranged options, but at this point, I think like that Slaneshi one up there, they're going to be using Chaos Magic to enhance them, just to make them more durable, make them less maintenance heavy, that's going to be a big thing for Chaos, and make their weapons more related to Chaos to be more effective and more unique, so that other Warlords won't be able to overcome them as easily. For example, if everyone is shooting around Quake Cannons, you want to be the dude who has something that can outrange or outkill the Quake Cannon. Pretty hard, but not impossible. 24 kilometers of range, you're going to have to try real hard. But not every Titan has a Quake Cannon. It's generally only the Nemesis ones, and even them, you will never have more than 2 shots, I think, for the Quake Cannon. At max, I think you'd have 3, but I rarely doubt... I super, super, super doubt that the Quake Cannon keeps any amount of reloads in the Titan, or if it does, those are the only ammunition available to the Titan. You won't be getting resupply for the Quake Cannon if you fire it. It is like a tactical nuclear weapon. Super heavy, but also long distance. So, important note here. It doubles up on Carapace weapons from the lighter Titans, so it can take extra weapons like extra turbo laser destructors. It can take all of these super heavy extra weapons that were Titan-grade weapons, but now they're just Carapace weapons. And it has its own anti-aircraft las cannons and heavy bolters. So you can see here these kind of side-mounted weapons and the equipment on their backs and stuff. It's not as obvious with these more modern Titans, but we can assume that their backs, shoulders, maybe the rear, underside of the carapace somewhere, there are these automated or human-controlled anti-aircraft las cannons or heavy bolters. Usually they're going to be double up or quadded up. Moving on to the Imperator Titan, which has way more stuff of that type, but a lot less things to talk about, interestingly enough. These are the all-rounders. They have the most important job in the Legion where they are available. They are super rare, probably, again, like I said, less than 100 of them currently kicking around in the entirety of the setting today. Warmongers and Emperor are the 2 different types. Emperors are the all-rounders, they're kind of the basic type, and then Warmonger is just a slight modification. They have more range support and a little bit more anti-aircraft, but they skimp on a little bit of the firepower, to a degree. All of their weapons are considered Archaeotech. Not a single one of these weapons that isn't a Carapace weapon is kind of available to other Titans. None of the ARM weapons are really easily replicable. Another one of the reasons why I think that a lot of the Titans that are in construction stole weapons from Titans that were currently in deployment because they didn't have the ability to make more of them. Energy weapons. The Vengeance Cannon. Similar to the Volcano Cannon for the Warlord, we've just, again, gone up another level, and when I talk about orbital weapons in the hands of Titans, this is an orbital flexible lance weapon. It is an orbital lance weapon. Can I repeat that again? Orbital, ship-grade anti-armor weapon. On its arm. It carries a gun that can shoot into space and shoot escorts out of the air. I don't think I need to emphasize how insane that is. An Imperator Titan can quite literally look up into the sky, see an enemy void ship, and shoot it like it's shooting skeet at a gun range. I don't think I can be more in your face about how crazy that is. These things are usually attached to hive structures or like large defensive works, and they're a big power pull. The goddamn Imperator has it on its arm. It literally will shoot at other Titans with an orbital weapon. It has its, where the Reaver has a bunch of artillery barrages on its side, and the Warlord has a bunch of Titan-grade artillery barrages on its side. That's cute. The Imperator Titan has an Exterminatus gun. Quite literally, an orbital artillery strike as its primary arm weapon. Love the Vengeance Cannon. Love this gun. The Plasma Annihilator. This is the biggest plasma weapon. Sub things that are on actual void ships. Now, it is an artillery gun. What does that mean? It has insane range, and it fires a single, super heavy, massive ball of plasma. This is dramatically explosive. Remember how I said that the plasma cannon would fire a regular, overcharged version of the plasma gun's fire? This fires the regular plasma blast gun's ammunition, or the plasma blast gun for the Warlord Titan, but multiply it by the overcharge value of that. Essentially, times it by 2, and that's the standard fire. It is described as a small sun exploding at the target, creating a 100-meter hole in the ground covered in black glass and burnt corpses. The fact that they call it the Sun Fry is so much funnier than you realize. It is a literal sun gun. It shoots a ball of plasma that explodes on contact with the ground, like a huge plasma mortar. Horrifying. Devastating to anything, period, end of story. Other Titans, dead. Anything smaller than a Warlord, dead with basically one shot. I could not imagine a Reaver just tanking a Plasma Annihilator shot that hit it directly. If it doesn't hit it directly, all of your shields are gone and your Titan is probably on fire. If this goes anywhere near a Warhound, that poor little doggie's dead. That Warhound is so dead. Kinetic weapons. The Doomstrike missile battery. At this point, I feel like I should be numb to the crazy, but I really have not spent this much time researching the Imperator to give up now. The Doomstrike missile is an 8-shot carousel of intercontinental ballistic missiles. I'm just going to give you a second to take that in. 8 shots of intercontinental ballistic missiles. It has the cruise missile arsenal of a U.S. naval vessel for an arm weapon. And these aren't unguided or like programmable guided. No, they're aircraft guided. AKA, it can fire beyond the line of the horizon to where an aircraft is actively engaged or scouting an enemy Titan, and it can fire 8 intercontinental ballistic missiles with thousands of pounds of high explosive on them towards that target. And they will hit with pinpoint accuracy because they are actually guided. So again, repeat it with me, really effective against a lot of things. It can hit lots of different targets. It can hit specific program targets. It has a huge amount of firepower and a great amount of explosive damage. Again, we're kind of beyond the level of ballistic missiles here. We are into the size of ICBMs. We are into the size of like thousands of pounds of high explosive, going at Mach speeds. So, really deadly. Hellstorm Cannon. This one was confusing to me because a lot of the art shows very contradictory things. I came down to it is a railway Gatling gun that doesn't rotate, by the way. It doesn't necessarily have to rotate. I think some of them do, but not all of them do. And it can either volley fire or be automatic. Now, what is a railway gun? It is a 450mm gun. That is a 100-ton cannon, but it has 6 barrels. Let me repeat that. 6 100-ton barrels, and it can fire fully automatic. Now, fully automatic in the case of a gun that big means bang, 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 bang. But by the time that the sixth bang has gone off, the first one is pretty close to being reloaded. The second one is maybe a second later, so it's going to go bang, 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 bang. I cannot imagine that this has more than 24 or more, or like 24 to 30 shots. But even that, 30 shots of 450 millimeter ammunition, that is horrifying. Not to mention the fact that, you might think, oh, well, it's kinetic, it's single shot, it's high explosive, it won't do so much against Titans. It can volley fire. It can fire all 6 barrels at once. 6 450 millimeter armor-piercing or armor-piercing high explosive shells. It doesn't matter. that would, 6 of those firing at the same time would flip a Baneblade like a coin. That is more firepower than the largest battleship in human history. On one arm of the Imperator Titan. And the fact that it can either volley fire or automatic means that it can choose. Do I want to destroy something super big today, or do I want to destroy 6 things that were big on their own, but in comparison with me, they're not really that big? Do I want to kill multiple Baneblades just for fun? Do I want to flex on a Warhound Titan and just gat it to death with like 2 rounds? It has the choice. The glory of choice. The Hellstorm Cannon. God, this thing's insane. Melee weapons. The Imperator's feet. Somebody mentioned this to me, and I kind of had a heart-to-heart with myself, and I really had to think about this. Because the Imperator has so much stuff that I, as the logic guy, have to think about, and, like, justify to myself of, like, how does that work? How do I okay that? How do I quantify that with logic? He mentioned to me the idea that the Imperator Titan has troops that it houses in its feet, or that it otherwise puts troops inside of its feet to deploy them, or to travel with it. I was actually so kind of split on this, in my opinion, that I actually wanted to leave it up to you guys. Myself, personally, I don't think it would be reasonable to put anyone inside of the feet of the Imperator. And here's my reasoning. One, the Imperator is not quick. It's not sprinting around the battlefield. While it can move over terrain with decent ability, that would only leave behind certain enemy units, or certain allied units. It wants to have a lot of supporters around it at all times, as you can see here, things like knights, infantry, support vehicles, things like that. But directly inside of the feet, I think there are forces that could keep up with it. Obviously, vehicles can't go in there. So, human beings could probably keep up with the Imperator Titan if it was traveling a little bit slow. They might have to keep up a quick jog to keep up with it. But Skitarii, Marines, anything like that, they can run alongside the Imperator Titan. And even people, a human being at a pretty solid jog, might be able to keep up with the Imperator Titan to the point where when the Imperator stops, they'll be able to catch up with it before any of the fighting really starts, or before it is too late for them to make any difference. But on the other hand, I think that having the feet be hollow, or having them have hollow areas, might weaken its melee ability, and also make it very top-heavy. And I really hate the idea of Titans being top-heavy. I think that it's a very dangerous concept to kind of mess with, because Titans already defy the laws of physics in a lot of ways, and I think it would be really reasonable to say that, well, the feet are how they defy them. Essentially, the feet are so heavy, so solid, so wide, that they can avoid falling over. And I think that making them lighter or making them have gaps or weaknesses would ruin that problem. And apart from that, apart from those 2 things, if you guys can justify saying that it's still a good idea for them to house troops, whether it's small numbers of troops, I do think that they have support troops all around them. So maybe people hanging a ride, maybe grabbing a rung of the foot, or even more reasonably, they have like a small section inside the foot, kind of like a curved area in front of the greave or behind the greave, where troops can just hang out, maybe catch a breather every now and then. I think that would be perfectly reasonable. Or even having Skitarii or Moderati be able to leave via the feet. Having ladders that go all the way down from the head and the cathedral down to the feet. I think that's possible, maybe reasonable. You guys can give me your opinions in the comments. And then the other melee weapons for Imperators are the standard array of slash and bash weapons. Imperators are slow, they're heavy, they have insane momentum, and a lot of their melee combat is just based off of they're so big that they can overpower and bully the heck out of almost any other Titan that comes against them. The only times when there are designated melee weapons for an Imperator Titan is basically for, like, Chaos Titans, or, like, Atrocitus, or things that have been possessed by demons. But apart from that, if you really wanted to put melee weapons on the Imperator, which is supposed to be a walking fortress, your best option would probably be something similar to the Reaver Fist or the Reaver Chain. So, in addition to all of those weapons I talked about, it has 6 extra carapace slots for lesser Titan weapons or for anti-aircraft or artillery batteries. You can see this really well in these pictures, these kind of forward-facing super heavy guns. I think these are probably on the order of, like, Medusa heavy siege guns, so those 280mm or 360mm long cannons. Again, that's super heavy artillery for the Imperials. Those are siege artillery that have 5 times or 10 times the amount of barrel as the Medusa does. And then this in the head would either be a quake cannon or a true super heavy artillery piece, something along the lines of an 800 or a 1000mm cannon. You know, something a little short. You know, just an 800mm cannon. What could go wrong? But Chaos. Chaos only has a couple of Imperator Titans that I know about. A lot of them do not work in reality. They will only work in the warp because Chaos needs to support them in order for them to be physically viable. But if they were to ever get them, if they were to capture them, it would be an insane acquisition. I love this picture. Well, it's got the little Marines running past the head, kind of fighting on this outcropping here. And I think this is a great reference piece for size as well. Same as this one. I love the size references for Imperators, and I wish they applied to other Titans as well. Extra weapons. So, the Basilica Barrage is one of the things that I think is kind of downplayed on older Titans, but has become more prevalent as time goes on. These are more flexible kind of battleship turrets on the Basilica, on the church, on the Imperator's back. These are usually slightly mobile, or they will have like a limited fire arc, and they essentially act as on-the-spot artillery support. You know, the Imperator does a lot of things to a lot of different people. Their weapons destroy basically anything they fire against, but they don't want to use those weapons all the time to fight every single target. Unlike other Titans, which might have to clear the way of any other troop that comes near them, the Imperator will never be deploying without other Titan support. It can focus all of its actual weapons, its arm weapons, on specific enemy targets. The artillery barrage essentially allows them to provide overwatch artillery support for everything around them. And the other thing is anti-aircraft missiles and flat cannons. Now, generally, I am of the opinion that flat cannons are more common in the Imperium, or even like flak las cannons or things like that, or multi-lasers or heavy bolters, are more common than anti-aircraft missiles. True guided heat seeker anti-aircraft missiles. The Imperator Titan is one of the few exceptions where I'm like, no, they would absolutely have heat-seeking crack missiles on the Imperator, and they would probably be at least 6 or 7 of them set up in a solid perimeter around the Imperator. These things are protected like a modern-day aircraft carrier would be. In terms of like anti-aircraft defenses, or like the Ticonderoga class frigates. They are super focused on making sure that nothing comes close. Nothing comes close to having a ghost of a chance of threatening the Imperator. Nothing. Nothing can get close. They want to make so damn sure that nothing touches this thing. Because it would be an unbelievable loss to have some poor mistake cause the death of the Imperator. So I think that's one of the reasons why it has so many extra weapons, all of them to either support other units when it's not using its arm weapons, or to effectively protect it from aircraft. Acknowledgements. Whew, that was a good video. I'm sorry to the folks who voted for miscellaneous Xenos weapons. I have not forgotten about that. Again, you'll get another chance to vote when you came through. When I started making this video, the other ones were winning. I think it's come back the other way. We'll have to see. But once this goes up, a new vote will be coming up. And also tomorrow, probably, I'll be doing a stream in addition to that. Gonna keep streaming. Gonna keep videos. Like I said, gonna try 4 either of streams or videos each week. Depends how the votes come in, but generally every 2 days you should see something from me. If you don't, it'll probably be a couple more days for the videos, and then I'll be able to do the streams more intermittently when I get a chance. So, without further ado, this has been long enough. I'm very sorry, but I wish you all a lovely good night.